Welcome in to the Play-by-Play, a sports media talk show brought to you by Awful Announcing, where I am currently dressed like a Cleveland Guardians middle relief pitcher because it's playoff time, and that's what I do come October. I'm Ben Axelrod, a senior editor at Awful Announcing. He's Drew Lerner, a senior editor at Awful Announcing. And on today's show, we are going to break down the race to replace Molly Qerim as the full-time host of ESPN's First Take. But Drew, first, let's talk about Shedeur Sanders because everybody is currently talking about the Cleveland Browns third string quarterback. It seems like if you turn on any sort of sports content, really kind of a bizarre situation where not only one of the more irrelevant teams in the NFL this year is being discussed, but their third string quarterback. The jumping off point for it this week was obviously the Browns benching Joe Flacco in favor of Dillon Gabriel, which in theory should move things around, although Shedeur is currently staying at third on the depth chart. And then you had the I guess incident, you could call it, not really an incident, the occurrence in the Browns locker room where Shedeur was asked about Joe Flacco's benching and decided to just act like a mime and pantomime his answers rather than give answers. Obviously behavior that only attracted more attention to the Cleveland Browns third string quarterback. So I live in Cleveland. I suppose I qualify as a Browns fan, although I call myself a Cleveland Browns observer at this point. So I'm pretty in the weeds on this, but Drew, as somebody from the outside looking in, what have you made of the amount of coverage that Shedeur Sanders has received this week?
Sorry, for those that weren't watching our live stream here, I decided to pantomime. I think I might actually be in the minority here. I think this is a legitimate A-block story. Like, I really do. Because if you think about the Browns situation, right, like obviously Flacco is not the future, and they're almost guaranteed to have a high pick next year. So you got to know, like, what does Dillon Gabriel have? What does Shedeur Sanders have? I think at some point, Shedeur Sanders is going to get an opportunity. So, like, if I were putting odds on it, like the odds that he starts a game for the Browns this year, I would say are pretty high. And, he's the son of Deion Sanders. It was the story of the NFL draft. Like, why wouldn't we be talking about him? Especially, this is a bit of a slower news cycle in the NFL, I think it's just like a completely legitimate story to lead with it. And obviously it has all of the makings of a tabloid type story, which, is kind of what our industry thrives on these days. So I love it. And I've been consuming it probably too much, more than I'd like to admit.
Your miming skills are great. You caught me off guard. That was one thing that impressed me about Shedeur was he wasn't just like a mime. He was an enthusiastic mime when he was pantomiming those answers. So I did appreciate that. Yeah, I agree it's a story. I think the idea of it being an A-block story, which it was all throughout the offseason as well. I mean, this was ESPN's lead story for days at a time in August. To me, my working theory on that, and it gets to something you just said, is like there's just nothing else to talk about. Like this has kind of quietly been like a boring NFL offseason, a boring NFL season. There's like how much can you talk about will the Ravens bounce back from 1-3? Like, did the Chiefs figure it out? Like, it's very surface level conversations that kind of lack exciting characters. There's not like a lot of exciting figures in the NFL. It feels like, at least in terms of what we've become accustomed to over the years. But like one thing that I guess this goes back to the draft, even before the Browns took him. I underestimated how famous Shedeur Sanders was. Even at Colorado, he felt like a distant third to Deion and Travis Hunter. Obviously as a quarterback, that changes come draft time. And I think as we've seen with Aaron Rodgers and other quarterbacks who have gone through that slide, when you slide, it actually makes you more famous because you have 2 or 3 days worth of NFL coverage just solely focused on you, it seems like. But I guess I just totally underestimated what a story Shedeur Sanders would be, even once or especially once the NFL season started.
Yeah, I would probably push back on him being less famous than Travis Hunter in at Colorado, like, Travis Hunter wasn't the one in KFC commercials and like Aflac commercials or whatever else Shedeur was in. And of course, he's got the Sanders last name. So I think he's always been kind of blockbuster in that way where people care about like what's going to happen with him. And they've cared about him for almost 3 years now, considering, going back to his freshman year at Colorado. So, I think you touch on a really smart point when you talk about the other storylines in the NFL. You have the Chiefs who like might be turning a corner, and that's like kind of fun. But, we've talked about the Chiefs for however many years now, right? Like we know what we're getting there. The Ravens, I think, is a pretty self-explanatory story where, they were dealing with a lot of injuries and, it's just going to be a matter of can they come back during the easier parts of their schedule when they get a little bit healthier and, shape up for the playoffs, kind of similar to, how they performed last year, if I'm being honest. And then you have stuff like, Sam Darnold versus JJ McCarthy versus Carson Wentz, which like, that's not a needle mover, right? Like whether or not the Vikings made a mistake by dealing Darnold. So like, what else are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about Shedeur freaking Sanders because, at some point he's going to play and we need to know if like, is this guy an actual NFL talent?
Well, and the other part is Shedeur keeps feeding the beast, right? He gave the quote last week where he said like, paraphrasing here, but yeah, look at the quarterback play across the league. Of course, I could be a starting quarterback. Meanwhile, you're the third string quarterback on a team that's going to be picking in the top 5 next year. And then you had the miming incident, like I said, miming occurrence this week. Like he could just give boilerplate quarterback speak answers. And I'm not saying this would all go away. I think he still would have been a talking point this week, but this makes it goes from okay, this is a Tuesday story to now this is a Tuesday through Thursday story.
And it's not only he's feeding it, his father is feeding it. The other people in the media are feeding it. Like what Rex Ryan was saying about him. Like it all feeds off of itself. And it's very cyclical in that way. And, maybe that's a bigger conversation with how our media works these days, especially on debate shows like Get Up and First Take. But I don't see how you like don't talk about this. Like, I don't think if you're sitting in Bristol as an ESPN producer and you're coming up with, all right, what stories are we going to, talk about today? There's nothing that really compares in terms of, mass appeal than the Shedeur Sanders story. So I don't know. I can't really blame ESPN and everyone else in sports media for talking about it as much as they do.
Yeah. And like, say what you will about ESPN, they have the analytics. They know what moves the needle. They wouldn't be talking about Shedeur Sanders if they weren't seeing some sort of tangible effect of what talking about him does to ratings, does to drive digital traffic and all of that. So like, yeah, I always like kind of roll my eyes when I see fans like say like, why are you focused on the third string quarterback? Why are you doing? Because it's like, because you're reading it, because you're paying attention to it. Because if we were talking about can Dylan Gabriel overcome a Brian Flores defense in his first start, like we would not be having this conversation right now. At a certain point, like the audience speaks, and the audience, again, to my surprise, they speak when it comes to Shedeur Sanders. He moves the needle.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same reason why First Take's going to talk about the Cowboys. And whatever Jerry Jones was saying after, the last game, like this is just how this industry works. And, when you're looking at the minute by minute data, which is, honestly what these executive producers are doing, they're saying, wow, we talk about this name or this name's flashing on the screen in the Chiron, like numbers go up. If we start talking about Sam Darnold, numbers go down. Like it's a very simple equation for these people. I think people kind of overthink like, well, what this is all about. This is what we as consumers are looking for, apparently. So it's a bit of a chicken or the egg thing, right? Like, is ESPN leading us down this path, or are we leading ourselves down this path? But at a certain level, like, everyone's at fault here. Like, clearly there's not an audience for in-depth, like you said, film breakdown, for the A block of First Take. You'll probably get some of that, but it's just not what most people are looking for in their sports media consumption.
For our viewers or listeners who don't know, you happen to be a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. So I don't know if that's clouding your excitement for how much attention the Cleveland Browns third string quarterback situation is currently receiving. But you have one of those quarterbacks who is one of those needle movers in Aaron Rodgers this season. And yet, despite the Steelers being 3-1 and maybe being the favorites in the AFC North, depending on Lamar Jackson's prognosis, what he hasn't moved the needle. I feel like I've barely heard about Aaron Rodgers this season. Maybe it's different from you. How is your first month of the regular season with Aaron Rodgers gone outside of the 3-1 start?
Yeah, I think, you had a little bit of it in week one after he made some comments about the Jets in his post-game press conference. But since then, there's been a couple of little things. Like I think there might have been even something after the Vikings game that got a little bit of attention. But I think most of the narrative, at least nationally, has been around his performance, weirdly enough. It's not been about like what he's saying during press conferences or kind of the weird stuff he can get into. It's about like, oh, Aaron Rodgers actually could, lead the Steelers to some sort of relevance in the postseason. I'm still a little skeptical on that. And actually kind of breaking down, all right, time to throw, average depth of target, that type of thing. That's kind of more of the, storylines I've been seeing regarding Rodgers, which is, I guess, a bit different than what we see most of the time. Kind of interestingly enough.
I still can't believe you guys won that Patriots game. That was nuts.
No, that's. I mean, I just like every game is. I need to call my cardiologist afterward. It's horrible.
Yeah. Does that have anything to do with TJ Watt's contract and not getting us back yet?
No, not quite.
All right. Well, let's shift this thing forward. Let's talk about First Take. It's been just about 2 weeks a little more than 2 weeks since Molly Qerim abruptly resigned from her post as First Take's full-time host, a job she occupied for 10 years. ESPN president of content Burke Magnus had told The Athletic's Richard Deitch that they would be auditioning replacements over the course of the next month and a half. I was wondering what that would look like. The first week, it was just Stephen A. Smith hosting the show by himself. And then come the following Monday, so last Monday, they were off and running. And not only are they auditioning new talents, they are auditioning new talents by the day. Like it is a new person in that chair each day. Just to run it down, some of the names we have seen, Amina Smith, Shea Pepler-Cornett, she's done it twice. Peter Schrager's done it twice. Courtney Cronin debuted today. And then you had MJ Acosta Ruiz, I believe, on Monday. Drew, what has stood out to you? Maybe not about the talent so much, but about this approach. It's kind of wild to me, like to be doing this day by day, especially considering like Mondays at ESPN are very different than Tuesdays and Wednesdays at ESPN during the football season.
Yeah, maybe this is because of, I'm a bit of a just media nerd generally. So like I'll keep up with, the cable news time slots and stuff like that. And this is a pretty common approach, I think, when you get rid of a talent. Like if you look at how CNN tried replacing Don Lemon or Fox News replacing Tucker Carlson, like they're just throwing people in there every night, trying to get a feel for what works, what doesn't. And I think this is kind of, industry standard at this point. Like, First Take is going to try out a bunch of different names, see what works. And quite honestly, I think the most notable thing about what we're seeing with the list of names that you just rattled off is a lot of them are just kind of anonymous people. Like, I don't know who Amina Smith is. I don't really know who Shea Cornett is. The last name, MJ, I'd never heard of her until you brought her up right before the show.
They didn't even introduce her on Monday. They just got into it. It was just like, we're into the show. Like there's a host here. And I don't know if they ever got around to introducing her.
And honestly, that might say something like about where they're leaning in this position. Like they probably don't want someone that's going to take up a lot of the oxygen in the room. I wasn't really paying attention to the industry enough to know that like where Molly Qerim stood in 2015 when she started the show, like if she was a more anonymous figure or if she was a bit of a more known commodity. Obviously, she grew into the role and played an important part in the show, but maybe that's like kind of where they're leaning, right? Like they just don't want someone to get in the way. They just want a normal moderator that's able to be a bit more traffic cop than personality. That doesn't mean they won't go with someone like Schrager or Courtney Cronin or even having Stephen A. host it himself. But I think all of those options would be sending the show in a bit of a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say you could break this down into three buckets. I think you could probably do it into two. And I think it would be, do we stay the course? And is it a traditional lesser known talent like an Amina Smith or a Shea Cornett? Somebody who's on SportsCenter, like has personality, can do the job, filled in for Molly when Molly was gone. Probably, to your point, is at a similar point in their career as to where Molly was before she was on First Take, where it's like she was around, she was on shows, but like she wasn't a part of a flagship, like personality driven show. She was more of an anchor, which I think also gets to like Molly developed into one of those personalities. And especially once you got into the post Skip Bayless era, the Shannon Sharp thing obviously went awry. Molly really was kind of that second voice most consistently on the show. Max Kellerman, obviously too. I'd probably say post Max Kellerman, Molly was really the second chair behind Stephen A. Smith on that show. So you could kind of follow that formula, or you could reinvent it a little bit. And I think the options for reinventing it would be Peter Schrager, obviously. I think Peter Schrager could step in there and be kind of that debate partner for Stephen A. Smith, in addition to being a host on a daily basis. You could just have Stephen A. Smith do it, which we've seen them do not only during the first week, but I think they did it at least on one day last week, where it's kind of a Stephen A. Smith and Friends type of show. And then, like, I'd say Courtney Cronin is probably somewhere in the middle, because she's more established as like not only a debate personality from her time on Around the Horn, but also as one of their NFL reporters. So that would maybe be kind of a happy medium. But yeah, there's definitely different ways they could go with this. And I think that's probably what you've seen over the last week, is them kind of fleshing out how they want to go about doing that.
Right. And that's why you give it time. I'm surprised Magnus even put a timeline on it. Like, I don't understand why you can't extend this throughout the whole football season and figure out who really meshes best. So the fact that they put a 30 to 45 day window on it is a bit interesting to me. On a slightly different note, I was kind of thinking earlier today, knowing that we were going to talk about Molly Qerim, and to me it was just surprising. I'm still surprised at how all this went down. Like, in the context of Stephen A.'s new deal, right, which extends, past 2030, I believe, maybe about 2030, somewhere thereabout. It's hard to believe that like she would give up this job, because if you're thinking about it, right, this is probably the moment where she has the highest leverage to negotiate a contract in her entire career. You've already locked up Stephen A. for 5 years, and now you've proven yourself as like such a critical part of First Take. And I think it's commendable that like she said, hey, I think my job is done here. It's run its course for me. But from like kind of a pure like dollars and cents perspective, if I'm in her shoes, I'm like, holy shit, like, this is probably the most money I'm ever going to be able to extract out of ESPN, knowing like I am Stephen A.'s like sidekick here. They just signed him for 5 years or however long it is. They kind of need me more than ever on this show. For her to pass that up and leave it on the table, I think is really notable and probably an underrated part of this story that we're not talking about enough.
Well, I think the other underrated part, and this has flown under the radar too, and this came out of the comments that Burke Magnus made to Richard Deitch at The Athletic in the aftermath of all this, is that even if Molly was going to stay at ESPN, they had already decided she was moving off of First Take. And so
Right.
that's like, then you do kind of get into like, well, what was her leverage from a negotiating standpoint? What were they talking about doing? And what ultimately happened in terms of those negotiations that led to such an abrupt departure? I still just have a hard time believing it's something as simple as like that it got reported and they couldn't stand to have her on the show for throughout the remainder of football season. I know Burke Magnus said there's not another shoe to drop, and I believe him. I don't think there's like anything necessarily nefarious that happened here, but it's just such a bizarre. Nothing about it adds up. Like, why was she leaving First Take? What were they talking about her doing? And ultimately, what happened that led to her and ESPN deciding, I still don't really get who decided it, that like, okay, we can't let this drag out throughout you have to go.
It's such a rare thing in television, right? Like, you are a prominent host on the most important studio show on ESPN. And to voluntarily like want to step out of that position, I could understand why. Maybe she wants to just do more journalistic stuff, like be a sideline reporter, host her own show, something along those lines, right? Like, I can totally understand that. But if you just look industry wide at how these things usually end, like, hosts are usually being dragged off of a show, not voluntarily stepping down, especially when it's a successful show, and especially when you consider like the point in her career where she probably had the most leverage to negotiate a really lucrative contract. I think it's pretty commendable that she stepped away from that. If all the reporting on this is true and what Burke Magnus said is true, that no matter what, she wasn't coming back to First Take. Even I'm maybe a bit skeptical. Like, I have a hard time believing she would step away from First Take entirely. But, I think there's still a little bit more to this story. And I hope we get to hear from Molly one day, just kind of about her reasoning for wanting to leave and why she would do that and what she wanted to do at ESPN other than hosting First Take.
Well, she did pop up this week. She hosted a Q&A with UConn head coach Dan Hurley to promote his new book. I don't think anything, though, too noteworthy came out of that on the Molly Qerim front. It sounded like it was something she had already agreed to do before she left ESPN. So, but yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see if she has anything to say about this and when she does. So, real quick before we get out of here. Yeah.
Okay. You go ahead. Okay. I just wanted to get your prediction and come back to the replacement question.
Exactly where I was going. Okay. You read my mind. I'll go first then. I will say right now I have Shea Cornette at like plus 120. I'm going to take Shea Cornette at plus 120. I think they're going to stick with kind of the traditional model. I'd still like to see them explore the possibility of Peter Schrager, but I'm going to say Shea Cornette, but I do think this drags out maybe longer than they thought. And I do think it becomes a Stephen A. Smith and Friends type of show for a while, especially because there's no rush. And that's like, Peter Schrager was already doing Thursdays on a pretty regular basis. Like they already were having a lot of these talents in. So I think they'll experiment maybe a little bit longer, but I think Shea Cornette right now is my front runner. What about you?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be Schrager. I don't think it's going to be Stephen A. I also don't think it's going to be Courtney Cronin.
Yeah, I don't either.
Honestly, if you're taking Shea, I would probably take the field, like someone that hasn't done it yet. Honestly, because I just think like they want someone that is just, like I said, a traffic cop. They just want someone that's going to keep Stephen A in check, move the show along, and maybe have the potential to build up to a Molly Qerim like level of rapport with the rest of the cast. But yeah, I think there's probably a handful of names that they're still going to try out at ESPN that we probably wouldn't even be able to name off the top of our heads.
Yeah, that's a good point. It will definitely be interesting to see, and we will have you covered on all the latest developments, both on ESPN's First Take and in sports media at large on Awful Announcing, as well as on the play-by-play. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe, leave a review, tell a friend, tell an enemy. We will be back with you next week, breaking down all the latest in sports media.